Okay. Yeah, first of all, me and my colleagues, we would also like to thank the West and East African Alliances on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its V20 finance ministers, and the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture for their support and collaboration in preparing this workshop. Today's workshop aims to highlight the takeaways from the recently published Best Practice Guide for the Development of Projects in the Voluntary Carbon Market in Yucatan. This guide was developed by the government of the state of Yucatan, Mexico, in collaboration with Climate Focus, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. The government of Yucatan has published this guide because Yucatan is a leader in promoting ecosystem restoration and conservation carbon projects to achieve its environmental, social, and economic goals. The guide explains how governments can direct private sector investments into carbon projects that deploy nature-based solutions and are characterized by high social and environmental integrity and benefits for local communities. The guide offers practical guidelines for all phases of the carbon project cycle, from conceptualization and design to verification and carbon credit issuance. This workshop will delve deeper into the issue of benefit sharing and facilitate the exchange of knowledge about principles and measures to promote fair benefit sharing mechanisms. This is an interactive workshop, and on the previous slide or the next slide, you should be able to see the structure of today's workshop. So we will first hear some opening remarks. Then my colleagues Carolina Inclán and Mercedes Fernandez will introduce us to benefit sharing mechanisms, after which you'll have the chance to ask some questions. We will then do an interactive activity where you'll break out into different groups and design a benefit sharing mechanism for a restoration project. And you will be able to choose the language for this activity through a poll that we'll share later. Then after 30 minutes, we'll reconvene a plenary and discuss your thoughts on the activity. And then we'll conclude with some closing remarks from George Hodgetts, who is a policy associate at VCMI. I'm really happy now to give the floor to our three guests, who will kick us off with some opening remarks. We will first hear from Mark Kenber, who is the executive director of VCMI and has worked with the government of Yucatan, as well as many other governments, to strengthen the integrity of carbon markets. Mark, please, the floor is yours. Really excited to hear your remarks.
Thank you very much, Georg, and welcome everybody who's here. It's great to see so many people participating in this, what I think will be a very interesting workshop. Both I'd like to thank not only the participants and the partners, but particularly to thank the Climate Focus team, UNDP, and of course, the government of Yucatan. And I have to say what a pleasure it has been to work with our colleagues in the Yucatan government over the last few months and year, both to publish the report, but also to participate in workshops like this one. The work that we, together with our partners, have done with Yucatan is part of our broader access strategies program. Many people know VCMI's work for what we do in providing guidance and claims for companies who want to use carbon credits as part of their corporate climate transactions. But an equally important and very central piece of work for us is our access strategies program. So I think it's axiomatic to say to everybody here that we need climate finance if we're going to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And we at VCMI believe that carbon credit markets and the carbon finance they generate can be an important part of that filling that climate finance gap if they are used well. That means delivered with integrity, will mobilize significant private sector finance for local initiatives, and deliver funding to regions with great potential to implement climate solutions that really importantly benefit local ecosystems and communities. And of course, that is one of the big themes of today's workshop. But we also believe that for that to happen, carbon credits cannot be just seen as another soft commodity that countries grow and sell, usually at the cheapest price, competing with each other. Carbon finance has the potential to leverage significant amounts of both public and private capital beyond carbon finance, and to be used to scale up and deploy technologies, skills, and other resources that would otherwise not be possible. So carbon finance, while maybe relatively small compared to other sources of finance, can have an outsized leveraging effect in terms of capital, technology, skills, and so on and so forth. And that is at the heart of our Access Strategies program. It's designed to support governments that want to host carbon market projects to establish the policies, process, regulations, and build and strengthen a cohesive governance of markets that underpin those objectives that I have just laid out, so that carbon financing and carbon markets are a central strategic and transformative part of countries' mitigation efforts, sustainable development efforts, and meeting their investment and capital needs. So recently, the Yucatán government published the best practice guidance. And this marks a pivotal moment in the evolution of carbon markets in Mexico, because it empowers stakeholders to develop projects that not only meet rigorous climate goals, but also strengthen and respect and strengthen the rights and livelihoods of local communities. And so VCMI welcomes Yucatan's leadership in this space, your commitment to high integrity carbon projects, which set a high bar for climate action. But again, so importantly, that the projects themselves respond to the needs and the priorities of the communities where they're situated, and also deliberately drive benefits to those communities as defined by those communities being part of the governance, design, and operation of the market. Many governments globally face this same challenge. And so what Yucatán has done is not just relevant to Yucatán or to Mexico, but globally. And so I think today's workshop cannot, again, in that same context, is not only of benefit for Yucatán and for Mexico, but for every country and every region that is looking to design and manage well carbon crediting projects in their country, in their region, in their sector, and do so in a way that not only includes public participation, community support, because that is the key to a sustainable and successful project, but because it's a right and objective in and of itself. So I'm really looking forward to listening to the discussions we're going to have, listening to the colleagues from Climate Focus presenting their work, but also the workshop. But before I sign off, I'd just like to finish by thanking a few of our friends and partners, the West and East African Alliances on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its V20 finance ministers, and you're going to hear from President Nasheed in a moment. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. The Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, and lastly, the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force for partnering with us today for the delivery of today's workshop. It's fantastic, along with many of our country contact group members who are with us, to have you all here today. And I really hope you find this workshop useful and that you continue to partner with us as we drive high integrity voluntary carbon markets that deliver for people and the planet. Thank you very much. Back to you, Georg.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for these great opening remarks. I will just pass on the word to our next speaker, which I'm really excited to announce. Next, we'll hear from His Excellency Mohamed Nasheed, who is the Secretary General of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and served as the president of the Maldives from 2008 to 2012. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It is lovely to be with all of you today. It's very, very encouraging that we have so many people taking part in this conference today. Well, it's not also it is not surprising that so many of you are taking part, because this is obviously so important. First, let me thank the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, for facilitating this meeting. We have a memorandum of understanding that CVF-V20 has a memorandum of understanding with VCMI, and it is really great that, Mark, that you are coming up with these so many important and relevant events. I also would like to thank the sub-government of Yucatán in Mexico. It's excellent that you have decided to be party to this. and that you are involved in this in carbon markets, especially developing credible carbon initiatives. Now, I have to give you an explanation or a little bit of who we are. The CVF-V20 is composed of, we are 70 member nations, including 15 members from South America and Caribbean region. And, together we are a lot of people, 1.75 billion people, 22% of global population, and we contribute very little to global emissions. And also we have very little percentage of global wealth or GDP. Now, why this has become so important is this carbon markets or carbon trading obviously is a source of revenue, for our member countries and therefore our communities, especially for the communities. So it's a new source of revenue that our members can tap into, and they can use it for prosperity, development, adaptation, mitigation, and also for prosperity for the forest and communities that live in farming. Secondly,
yes, I can hear you.
This is also an avenue for conservation and restoration of nature. If you want to go into a carbon exchange, you have to protect your tree. And you have to make sure that the tree remains. And you also have to make sure that you're not selling the tree twice. And you have to come up with legislations and regulations, management plans on how to look after nature. Now, I have some figures here. CVF countries, we are the lungs of the planet. We occupy the vast majority of the woodlands or nature of this planet now. The industrialized countries have cut down their trees, a lot of it, and lost most of their biodiversities. Just out of the blue, yesterday I learned that the only monkey in Europe is now in just one of the European countries, and everywhere, all the monkeys are gone, and a lot of the biodiversity is actually lost in the industrialized countries. Nature is also lost. So, but we have it, and we have to maintain it. We have to look after it, and others have to pay for it. So this is the whole essence of carbon exchange, is that that we look after our trees and others are able to pay for that service. You must understand, a tree is not only sequestering carbon, it is also giving a whole lot of other eco-service value. It's creating a whole biodiversity, which again, even though we do not have a biodiversity credit, which is needed, but it's big. Well, the tree is doing so many other things, and therefore the protection of the tree is important, and someone has to pay for that. Now, the CVF countries have over $210 billion of investment opportunities.
Just something that really is important for countries to manage.
And I think these investment opportunities, if it can be tapped into, would benefit the other more prosperous countries as well. Very often we now hear that prosperous countries want to have growth in their economies. I mean, I kind of think that you can milk a cow to a certain extent. And after that, it's kind of difficult to get growth out of them. So if we get growth in our countries, and which we have double-digit growth, their growth, and start trading with us, everyone benefits. So I think the investment opportunities in our countries are huge, and that can be coupled with carbon exchange programs. So recently, the CVFV20, we published with the Bridgetown Initiative 10 super levers on how to, in today's language, unlock this 210 billion worth of investments. So one of the levers is carbon exchange. So many countries in the CVF, I know for a fact, wants to do a carbon registry. They want to have a carbon trading framework. They want to do their nature management plans. They want to do legislations on these things, and they want to have the proper bylaws that would make sure that conservation is actually taken care of. Now, our problem is that, last week, I came back from Gabon. Gabon is sequestering net sequestration is 100 million tons of carbon a year. And Gabon would like to do a carbon trade, but the price that they are offered is low, and partly because they need to develop all the frameworks, they need to develop all the legislations, regulations, management plans, and so on. So they like the assistance to do that. I was speaking to Environment Ministry in Congo. Wherever I speak to, they are all talking about it, and they all want to know how they can go about it. Of course, some of the CVF countries are far advanced. In Ghana, for instance, where I am now residing, they have an excellent carbon framework. They have done the necessary legislations, and they have also done the necessary regulations and execution methods, meaning, looking after the trees, having proper rangers and all sorts of people who would look after these plants. So to increase the value, the carbon credit has to be credible, and that basically means, is the tree there? And have you actually cut down the tree? Or have you sold the tree twice? So not to do that, we need these frameworks. We need the legislations. We need the regulations. So we need VCMI. We need the sub-government in Mexico, and all of you who are working in this area to assist these countries. Now, before I end, wait, hold on. The IMF thinks that it's $85 a ton if you are to maintain 1.5 degrees. But we offered $5, $10. This is ludicrous, and of course, people would not sell it. But if you want to maintain the tree, you have to pay for it. And a way of paying for it is through these carbon exchanges. Now, the money also should go to the local communities, to the forest communities, to the farmers. I mean, many people have stopped farming because it's not giving them the kind of necessary revenue for them to make a living. Now, with the carbon exchange revenue coming in, then, it gives you a little bit more money, and therefore farming becomes far more viable. Afforestation becomes viable. Keeping a tree becomes viable. And so this is an area that we must work hard on. So before I end, because I come from the Maldives, and because a third of the CVF countries are reef countries, we need to look and think on how much carbon is the reef capturing. Now, the received wisdom and science is they talk about seaweed and mangroves, but no one is talking about the reef. But there is some science to suggest that the reef is also sequestering carbon. So this is an area I hope that people would go into, and more science would come out and say how much is the reef capturing, how much carbon a reef capturing. We know that an average tree apparently captures 15 kilograms of carbon. Well, thank you, and I can't thank you enough. VCMI, the government of Mexico or the sub-government of Mexico, and everyone who is taking part in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And I'll pass on the word to Adrián Cataño, who is the Director of Planning and Climate Change at the Secretary of the Environment of Yucatán, Mexico, and has led the work on the best practice guide from the side of the government of Yucatán. Adrián, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Es para nosotros un gusto participar en este webinar sobre la guía para proyectos de carbono responsables. A nombre de nuestra secretaria, la licenciada Janine Quijano Tapia, le extendemos un afectuoso saludo a todos los que nos acompañan el día de hoy de manera virtual, agradeciendo especialmente a nuestros compañeros de Climate Focus,
I would like to thank our colleagues
PNUD
of
y Biofin,
BCMI
quienes nos apoyaron en la elaboración de esta guía de buenas
BCMI
prácticas para
that
el desarrollo de
support
proyectos
us
de
in
mercado voluntario de
developing
carbón.
this guide of
Bueno,
best practice.
¿cuál fue el objetivo de publicar esta guía?
What
Bueno, el objetivo
was
fue que
the
el
goal
gobierno
of
del
this
Estado de
guide?
Yucatán cuente con un
Well, the
instrumento que
government of
permita
the
orientar
state
a las
wanted to
comunidades
have a
rurales,
tool to guide
gobiernos y
the
sectores
rural
privados en la
communities,
implementación de
private
proyectos
sector, and government in the implementation of carbon projects based on the principles of transparency, equitable rights, and the rights of indigenous people. These are practical and simple guidance on how to implement a carbon project with high quality standards and transparency, as well as implementing good practices in terms of sharing benefits so that
and the consistency of the participants in attending it, which is why, although we've asked for focal point from each ministry, we're very happy. We also asked for technical experts who we really
Bueno, ok. Bueno, continúo. ¿Por qué Yucatán decide elaborar esta guía? Bueno, como todos saben, el estado de Yucatán cuenta con una importante superficie forestal que presenta aproximadamente el 79%, que representa aproximadamente el 79% de su territorio del estado, mismo que alberga una gran diversidad biológica y una importante fuente de servicios ecosistémicos y socioculturales. Sin embargo, estos beneficios
cultural benefits, those benefits, however, have been deteriorated.
Deforestación y la degradación forestal.
That's why
Alternativas y
we
propuestas
needed to look
encaminadas a
for
enfocarse
some options
a
to
atender los diversos conflictos y problemas en la pérdida de ecosistemas forestales. Una manera de abordar
meeting
esta
this
problemática es
needs and the loss
precisamente a
of
través de
forest.
soluciones basadas en la naturaleza,
We want to
implementando
develop
acciones que permitan proteger las
NbS
selvas, gestionar de
solutions
manera sostenible
by
y restaurar
implementing
ecosistemas
measures to
naturales,
protect
así como
the
aquellos
jungle
perturbados
and
por
to
las actividades
restore
antropogénicas.
some natural
Estas
systems.
acciones abren una ventana
These
adicional de
actions open
oportunidad a la
a very
obtención de recursos
important
económicos a
window
través del
to
mercado voluntario de
obtain
carbono,
financial
a la cual
funds
puede ser
by,
aprovechado por las comunidades
through the
rurales
carbon
con un
Ou
cierto grado de
initiative.
marginación, pero con un gran
Hein.
potencial
C'est clair qu'on a
social.
on a dû
La
community.
tarea no es fácil, nos queda muy claro,
It is not
pero
an easy
el
task
tema del mercado voluntario de carbono es
for
un tema
us,
complejo
but the carbon market is
poco
very
conocido para las
complicated,
comunidades rurales,
not very well
así como
known
también para los
by
gobiernos que se
rural
están involucrando
communities
cada
as
vez
well
más
as the
en
governments
este
that
tema.
are
Por ello es
more and more
necesario
involved
contar con
in this
instrumentos que
topic.
permitan orientar a
That's
las
why we
comunidades
need
rurales,
to
gobiernos
guide
y sectores
rural
privados
communities,
en la
governments,
implementación de
and the
proyectos
private
de carbono
sector
bajo los
in
principios de
implementing
integridad,
carbon projects
sostenibilidad,
based on these
transparencia y distribución
principles of
equitativa de beneficios,
transparency
pero
and
sobre todo
sustainability,
respetando los
among
derechos de los
others,
pueblos
by
indígenas.
respecting
Con la publicación de esta guía de buenas prácticas de mercado voluntario de carbonos, Yucatán se posiciona como un referente a nivel nacional en la promoción de proyectos de carbono de alta calidad y en el mercado voluntario de carbonos como una herramienta para la conservación de los bosques. Bueno, finalmente les comento que agradezco mucho la invitación, pero lamentablemente por un tema de agenda no podremos estar toda la sesión con ustedes. Sin embargo, dejaré aquí en el correo, en el chat, dejaré mi correo electrónico personal por si necesitan o tienen alguna duda sobre la implementación de los proyectos de carbono responsables que se están implementando en Yucatán. Muchas gracias a todos por su atención y muy buenos días.
Thanks, Adrian. And thanks again to all our speakers who delivered some opening remarks. Really great to hear from all of you. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you all here. Before we move on to the next floor of this workshop, just a kind reminder that all of you rename yourselves, if not done so yet, to include your name, your organization, also your country. And I also just wanted to remind you that we have simultaneous translation, of which we encourage you to take advantage. There is translation to Spanish and French, so please make use of that if you need it. Yeah, now we're moving into the next block of this workshop, which is an introduction to benefit sharing mechanisms. But before we get started, we would also like to share a poll, which my colleague Carolina can launch in just a second. The poll will help you select the language in which you would like to participate in the interactive activity that we have prepared and that we'll get to after this presentation. I'm pausing here for a few seconds to give you time to respond to this poll. I see people are responding. That's great. Thank you so much. We'll break you up into different groups accordingly based on your preferred language for this activity. I'll give it a few more seconds, and then I am passing the word to my colleagues Carolina Inclán and Mercedes Fernandez, who will provide us with an introduction to the issue of benefit sharing. Carolina and Mercedes have prepared a presentation, and after their presentation, we'll have approximately 10 minutes for a round of question and answers.
I would like to intervene on time management. Am I allowed?
Yes, of course. Well,
Yeah, thank you so much. I wish if you could really manage the time exactly, because, you know, given the time difference, we're supposed to leave our offices, and we have a
yes.
very tight time management here. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the reminder. We'll try to stick to the schedule as much as possible. Thank you. Okay, with that, I'll pass it to Carolina and Mercedes for their presentation. And please, yeah, please make also use of the poll. Thank you.
Today we're going to present on benefit and equitable benefit sharing for carbon projects, and we're going to focus on nature-based solution projects because sometimes, you know, the benefit sharing can be different when it's a technology-based carbon project. Before getting started, I just wanted to highlight, so what are the objectives of this guide that the government of Yucatan published, because it's not only focused on benefit sharing, it's broader, and it presents the government's vision and on how to develop nature-based solution activities through the voluntary carbon market, but that these activities are aligned with their priorities. And with this in mind, they focus on three main aspects. So the first one has to do with, okay, how can we encourage or incentivize the private sector to develop high integrity nature-based solution projects? The second one has to do to guide also the private sector. They had a lot of questions about complying with federal and state regulations, for instance, for land use activities. Mexico does not have a specific policy or regulation for the voluntary carbon market, but of course, when you work with land use and communities in Mexico, there are specific rules and regulations that you need to consider. And then the third one, and one of the most important ones, is that the government really wants to ensure that there are good projects and they're fair, and that there are fair benefit sharing agreements with the communities, with the owners of the lands. And this should also be reflected in the contract structures that they negotiate, you know, between the project developers, the investors, and the communities themselves. Very quickly, I'm not going to go into the details of the guide completely, but I just want to show you that the guide has 6 main sections that aim to provide a complete understanding of a carbon project, how can they develop it? So the first one, before getting started, it's all related to like carbon market, what are the key concepts, but at the same time, what do we mean when we talk about integrity, and how can you ensure that actually a project is of high integrity? Then we have all the project development cycle, from the project planning, project development to the sale of carbon credits. And then they have these 3 core sections that their main objective are basically social safeguards. So how can they ensure this? The first one has to do with social safeguards when working with communities and all the governance around this. The second one has to do with benefit sharing agreement, and we're going to discuss the topic today. And the third one has to do with representing these social safeguards and benefit sharing agreements in the contracts that are signed between the different parties. So now jumping into benefit sharing, what is it and why it's important? So designing the benefit sharing agreement is an iterative process. And this is between, the project developers, investors, but also the community members. And here's basically where they determine the total project value and allocate that value across all actors involved. And sometimes when we talk about benefit sharing, we think that it's only about distribution, like the shares or the profits, but it includes much more than that. So first, it's very important to have very clearly who will bear the costs, what are these costs, and what are the benefits. And when there are carbon projects that are developed together with communities, it's also very important to realize that this is not only limited to those that have land rights or primary carbon rights. There are other members of the communities, such as young groups or women, that not necessarily have these legal rights, but they should also be entitled to receive some benefits. And these are some of the questions that we're going to review today. So what are these benefits that are included in here? What are the costs? What are the arrangements that can be in place so we have a fair benefit sharing agreement? And, how can these benefits can actually reach the beneficiaries? Now, why is benefit sharing a crucial aspect in project development? So often communities are not familiar with the economic dynamics of voluntary carbon market activities, with the costs, how payments are received. Even they sometimes don't have information about who is buying these credits or what even are the mechanisms to distribute this. And as you may be aware, and some of these concerns were already mentioned in the opening remarks, there have been a lot of concerns about this topic and whether local communities, owners of the land, are really receiving a fair share of the financial benefits of these projects. Sometimes we see that there are also unfavorable terms that have been already agreed in signing contracts, or sometimes there are very big promises that, these projects would make communities very rich. And many times we've seen that also there's insufficient community involvement, in how the decisions are taken when you go to a benefit sharing agreement. And of course, a well-designed benefit sharing is central to the project continuity, because as you know, like these projects, they need to last many, many years so they can actually comply with the climate benefits. Now, here's a list of principles for benefit sharing agreements. Of course, we can find more and more. These are just some of the most important ones. And here, what is very important is that first and most, the communities are considered as partners and also owners in the decision-making process of the project development. And there are 3 main aspects that should lay the foundation of a benefit sharing agreement. The first one has to do with being a fair process, how decisions are taken, or being able to participate. The second one has to do with the fair terms, how this is going to be divided and how are we going to make sure that it's actually fair. and how it's going to be distributed. And in this case, it's very important to highlight that it's just not only the investor or the buyers, for instance, that are taking the risks in the project, but also local communities are making, changes to their livelihoods or to the economic activities. And this should also be considered, and they should be also financially compensated for all of these things. And most important, it is, the beneficiary agreement, it's always an iteration process that needs to be constantly discussed and constantly updated as the project progresses, but also as there are changes, for instance, in the revenue or in the carbon credit prices. So the way that we designed this guide, and of course there may be others, is that we provided a very simple step approach to decide on a benefit sharing agreement distribution. The first one has to do with clearly defining, okay, what is the project outcome, what are the costs, but also what are the benefits. The second one has to do with, okay, now that we know how it's going to be financially, the project financially, we can decide on the beneficiary mechanism. So how are we going to distribute, the share of the cake, basically? And then the third one has to do with how to implement this benefit sharing mechanism, sort of like the implementation mechanisms. Now, the first step has to do with to determine the cost and benefits. And this is the first step. It's crucial. And here the project developer and the communities must determine all of these different aspects, no? It's very important to mention, for instance, that the ratio of the benefit sharing between the project developer and a community that has been agreed is maintained, regardless of what may be made after the distribution. Of course, all of these financial data should be documented and be updated, as I mentioned. And here in the figure, what we can see is an example, of how this would look like. So first we have the income. And of course, the income of the carbon credit sales must cover all the costs. So here we have, for instance, project development costs, everything necessary to develop the carbon project, like the feasibility analysis, all the validation, monitoring, verification, and issuance of carbon credits. And here it's important to, for instance, include capacity building for communities. And then we have the project operational costs. Those are related to the operation and execution of the project. And this one is very important, specifically when we're talking about, or primarily when we're talking about nature-based solutions projects where the communities are going to be involved, that there's salaries for them, and that these are also fair salaries, for the contribution to the project. And we have also operational costs. And here, these operational costs should also include the opportunity cost of the communities for participating in this project. For instance, sometimes they maybe start to seize an income because they're not performing an activity that was more lucrative after committing to, for example, restore the forest. But one very important aspect are the community development costs. And it have to be with investments made in the community that also improve the livelihoods from the communities. And this should be considered also part of a cost. And one example, for example, improving health facilities, training capacity building, or developing small businesses. Because in the end, these investments will be for the communities to keep the incentives of keeping this project in the long term and not just in the short term. Then it's also important to consider that there are two types of benefits. So we have the non-monetary benefits that are basically the result from successful project operation. We can talk about, for instance, co-benefit like ecosystem services, improve air quality, or even alternative income generation, for example, from honey production or from mangrove restoration areas. But of course, it's also important that we consider the salaries and the income that they receive. And when they have these discussions about the benefit sharing, it's very important that the non-monetary, but also the monetary benefits are clearly outlined. Now, here I'm going to show you very quickly two different cost structures of a project. And I'm showing this because I think it's important that we understand that all the projects are different and there is no magic formula to design the benefit sharing and to say, okay, which are going to be the percentage that we're going to define. And I took this from a playbook that builds on learnings from USAID and a program that they implemented in Mozambique. And they show how, depending on the type of project, you can have a cash flow and capital raising strategies. So in this case, for instance, we're looking at a typical project that it's for avoided emissions. So you can think in a red project. Here you can see that, this type of project requires less capital investment in the beginning, and it's already able to issue the credits within 1 or 2 years of validation. This is, requires lower upfront investment, and it's relatively consistent. It has relatively consistent revenue over the time. But then, if we, for instance, take a look at a removal project, let's say restoration project, it's a bit more capital intensive. And in this case, of course, the project needs more time. So it is able to issue the credits only after 4 or 5 years. And this is based on the speed of the planting and the biomass growth. These are considerations that in the end will influence the project revenue and the profit. And what more can I say? Yeah, and in this case, for instance, the upfront costs can be even like 50 to 80% of the total project cost. And this includes, for example, sourcing the seeds, settling up the nurseries, training communities within the tree planting, all the monitoring, and it has a lot of direct labor cost associated with it. Now, how to share the benefits generated by the sale of carbon credits, sort of like the step 2. Once that we know what are the costs and the benefits, how are we going to distribute it or divide the total share? I'm not going to go into the detail on this table, but what I want to say is that most standards, they don't set any rule, a specific rule about how this should be done, but they just offer some guidance, and it would really depend on the standard how this is measured. For instance, Plan Vivo, they already state that 60% of the income from the sale of the carbon credits should go to the communities, but this is only one case, and each standard focuses on different guidelines. So how to share these benefits, given that it's very challenging? So the first message is, of course, that there's no single formula for revenue sharing, but there are appropriate criteria to see how this can be considered. The first one is that for it to be fair to communities, there must be a balance. So for instance, you need to balance how do you protect communities. For instance, you can include predictable payments to the communities even before the revenue has been generated. And then you can combine this with variable payments that are already linked to the sale of the carbon credits. So in this way, you can balance both aspects, and you ensure that the community receives an income when the project is still in the development phase. And of course, this again is crucial to ensure that there's long-term sustainability of the project. Now, very quickly, I will go into the detail of these two different aspects. So of course, we have first payments at the beginning. This can be a bit risky, right? Because the project has no clarity on what are going to be, the final profits. But, it safeguards the communities from revenue shortfall. It ensures payments when the revenues are low, and they guarantee community benefits, no independent of the profit. And here are some options, that could be used. And then on the other side, we have the payments that are based already on the project outcomes. In this case, we have to decide also in 3 different aspects, and you will see these aspects in the activity that we have later. So what does it mean, and what are the implications, for instance, that the benefits are distributed in cash, or for instance, they are distributed through carbon credits, for instance, that would need, for instance, that the community has all the governance and knowledge in place to be able to sell the credits by themselves. At the same time, for instance, the profit, it's less risky for the financial scenario of the project because you already know and you already cover all your costs, but it's more uncertain because, credits may have a lower price than expected. And at the same time, you also have the revenue, but then, the revenue is easier to calculate and it's easier to communicate to stakeholders. It gives more certainty, but also, it may reduce a bit the project profits. So these are all different aspects that you need to take into account. And then how do you distribute the benefits? This is basically ensuring that there are governance systems in place or in instruments, where that there's transparency of, how's this money being used, that there's continued communication if anything changes. There are oversight mechanisms within the community, but that also the governance processes of the community and their ability to manage this funding is also strengthened through the process. And now I want to pass the word to Mercedes, and she will talk about why this is relevant for governments and what are the actions that they're taking in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you to all the attendants in this event. I can see already in the chat there are a good number of participants who make part of governments, different ministries. I can see finance, environment, which is actually very useful for us, considering that one of the big topics at the moment in terms of regulating carbon markets is how to regulate benefit sharing, and at the end of the day, whether benefit sharing should be regulated at all. As my colleague Carolina mentioned before, and just for you to know a little bit of what happened in the past with the topic of benefit sharing under carbon projects. Most of the carbon standards years ago, they didn't regulate at all benefit sharing. Benefit sharing per se were not, or benefit sharing agreements or benefit sharing plans were not even published under the carbon standards. Why was that? Because it was considered a sensitive topic. It could probably disclose certain confidential information, some of the economic rationale of the project. So carbon standards were not very demanding in this respect. Today, things are changing, carbon standards are evolving. They understood that the benefit sharing, a fair benefit sharing plan, is at the end of the day, the core of a good carbon project, and is actually one of the qualities that promote integrity. So they are becoming more and more demanding. So carbon standards are becoming more and more demanding. In the same way, buyers are requiring information on the benefit sharing plan, on how benefits are distributed, how much goes to the communities. They want to check as well, not only how the benefit sharing plan has been designed, but also how it's implemented. And we see precisely more and more private buyers, investors, that they ask information precisely through the years, both on the design as on the implementation of the benefit sharing plan. Basic terms, they want to understand exactly whether those benefits are reaching communities and whether they have some impact. But the final actor that is concerned with benefit sharing is actually governments, and I'm gonna go relatively quickly because we don't have a lot of time, and we would like to have also good discussions with you. But just for you to understand, so as I said before, the question here is whether governments should regulate how benefit sharing in carbon projects should apply or not. For nature-based solutions projects, the question is even more important because normally these projects take place or involve communities. Sometimes those areas where these kind of projects are developed belong to the communities. Often they're community forests or they have similar classifications, and clearly these raise important topics. How can, at the end of the day, governments regulate benefit sharing? There is not a simple solution. There is not a specific model. Each government will opt for a different approach. It depends as well on the national circumstances of the country or the type of, let's say, regulation the country already has. But it's true that more and more governments are adopting carbon market regulations applicable both to voluntary carbon projects, but also to what we call, let's say, projects or programs developed under Article 6, in which they require at least more details on benefit sharing. Some of them are even going further, and they impose certain percentages of distribution of carbon revenues to communities. I'm, for instance, thinking probably many of you know better than me your own regulations, but I'm thinking, for instance, right now on Kenya. Kenya adopted last year, if I remember correctly, a regulation by which they impose certain percentage of distribution of carbon revenues in those areas where carbon projects are developed, and those areas are, let's say, a community area. So basically, belong to communities. They don't apply this whenever the carbon projects are implemented in private areas, but only, as I said, in this particular category, community projects, community areas where nature-based solution projects are implemented. Other countries prefer simply to mention some type of checklist that this benefit sharing plan should contain, like, let's say, for instance, discussions with communities, approval by the communities, the display or the explanation of the different components, how the benefit sharing plan is going to be implemented. Others are not even talking in these carbon market regulations that are adopting actually on the benefit sharing plan. Most often they mention that the benefit sharing plan should be fair, should promote community interest, but no more than that. Can we pass to the next slide, please?
Yeah, this is actually all what we prepared for today. Thank you, Mercedes. And we are behind on the agenda, so I think we're gonna skip the questions for now, and then now we're gonna go through